And now maybe to look a bit more on the worker side, I would like to introduce our panel to you guys. We have a panel of three speakers and a fantastic moderator. And during the panel, we will be looking into how gig workers can regain their negotiation power and build a collective voice. The moderator of our panel is Valeria Pulignano, who's a professor in sociology at the Center of Sociological Research at the KU Leuven. And Valeria has published extensively on topics related to sociology of work, comparative European industrial employment relations, but also the labor market and inequality, working conditions, and workers' voice. Welcome, Valeria. Valeria will be part of a panel where she is joined with Mark Stuart, who's a pro-dean for research and innovation at Leeds University Business School. And Mark's research has focused mainly on the impact of new digital technologies on the future of work and employment. Welcome, Mark. We're glad to have you here. Our other speaker of today is Denise Kasparian, who's an assistant professor and researcher at the University of Buenos Aires and National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina. And her latest book, Co-operative Struggles, which I hope everybody will read, expands the theoretical horizons regarding labor unrest by proposing new categories to make visible and conceptualize conflicts in the new worker cooperativism of the 21st century. Welcome, Denise. And also with us today is Iftikhar Hamad, who is the Global Labor Law Manager at the Wage Indicator Foundation and the Director of the Center for Labor Research in Pakistan. He heads the labor law team at the Wage Indicator, and he also has helped raise awareness about labor rights in over 140 countries now. And while working in the world of labor, he's been engaging with the government of Pakistan with fair work and also a lot on gig economy regulation. Welcome to your panel. Valeria, I'm happy to give the floor to you and kick us off.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Thank you very much for giving me the honor to actually moderate this panel with these three excellent speakers. So I think it's going to be a very interesting and certainly important discussion. I also would like to welcome Mark and Denise and also Iftikhar. Well, I think we have the possibility also to give over to you to display some slides if you might have any. If not, we just go as it is. So as Fiona said, this panel is going to focus, I think, on workers and particularly looking at how these workers in the gig economy can regain negotiation power and building a collective voice. Now, the way in which this is looked at within the wage indicator is a very broadly one. So again, we want to kind of look at improving play level fields for all people from different kind of perspective. And I think that this panel will be followed up also later on by Martin, showing us up interesting insights about what the wage indicator has been doing here in terms of best practices for guaranteeing a voice to workers. But I would like to start first here, posing the three of you, a first question, which in fact looks a bit at what you have been doing in this field, and both from a practitioner and from an academic research perspective, and trying to see how you think your research or also your expertise in the field can inform us about the way in which workers can, in fact, build power and can build collective voice, and what are the problems and opportunities that you see, in fact, workers do have in the platform economy. As you know, you have 5 minutes each on this question. I would like to start because I know that Iftikhar has some issues related today. So I would like to start perhaps with you, Iftikhar, if you want to start to point to an answer to this question from your point of view.
Yeah, thank you very much, Valeria. It would be great if I could talk after 10 minutes because there would be call for the prayers coming from outside. So it would be great if I can talk after 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, so you want to just okay, that's fine. Because I thought that you wanted to go first. So let me start then in the normal way. So I would go first to Mark and then pass it over perhaps to Itzkar. Mark, so the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Valeria, and thanks to the Wage Indicator for inviting me today. So I'm part of a team at the University of Leeds, and it's quite a large research team that's been looking at labour protests globally. So we've constructed a database, which we have labelled the Leeds Index, because we're all based at Leeds doing this research. And we've been looking at labour protests around the world, mainly looking through newspaper articles in particular countries that document labour protests or platform workers. And following on from Uma's categorization, we're mainly looking at the ride-hailing sector and various delivery sectors, because that is where most of the protests in these articles are occurring. We've collected a massive database of newspaper articles, and then we've coded them into a series of variables which we've done analysis of. So we're able to offer some insight into this idea, I guess, of worker power and also examples of collective voice and collective action through specifically looking at protests. And if we think of power, power can take many forms. So workers can have structural power, they can have institutional power. Fundamentally, we've been looking at associational power. Essentially, how do workers organize? How do they represent themselves in order to further their own interests? And we're looking at that through the prism of protests. And what we fundamentally find, I guess, is the real importance of understanding worker self-organization. So we're really seeing the generation of worker power and worker action and voice through informal groups of workers and worker self-mobilization rather than more traditional labor actors like trade unions, although we see great variety across the globe. And I'm talking here in general terms and general patterns, but what we find is that most protests are mainly led or involve informal groups of workers, but they would be in some circumstances supported by other actors like trade unions. And those trade unions could be either established trade unions or they could be more grassroots trade unions. And what we're finding is those combinations sort of vary across different parts of the world. We're also finding good examples of worker collectives, and I know some colleagues are interested in this. And so we find these variations across the world. Trade unions overall are involved in around 50% of all cases in terms of supporting protests, but we find very few collaborations between established unions and grassroots unions. We find worker collectives in about 20% of cases globally, but they are predominantly in the regions of Africa and South America. Unions, established unions or grassroots unions, are more prevalent in Europe. And we see more grassroots unions in South America. But overall, it's individual groups of workers who are, I guess, most predominant in some of these protests and actions. And what we find is the labor actors themselves are more focused on particular types of issues. So when we see protests that are fundamentally driven by more informal groups of workers, the key issue there is pay. When we see more involvement by established unions, the key issue tends to be more around employment status and perhaps not unsurprisingly, trying to develop more institutional forms of voice through unionization and other forms. Grassroots unions tend to be more focused on supporting workers around issues of pay, but also to some extent unionization. And workers' collectives tend to be more involved in building collective actions around pay and deactivation, issues around deactivation. But like I've said, this does vary quite considerably around the world. And we also find that the way in which these labor actors sort of engage in process varies. So workers really, informal groups of workers are demonstrating or they're going out on strike. These demonstrations and strikes are often very short term, often involve very few workers, and they could be akin to the old idea of work stoppages or just walkouts. Established unions don't tend to support strikes as such. They're more likely to support demonstrations. What are the key issues that we find around this? Well, one of the key issues is that these protests are often very short term and do involve very few workers. So we are trying to work out what happens next after many of these protests in terms of whether voice can become more enduring. And there's key issues, I guess, around mobilizing protests in a more coordinated way. We're starting to see this, where you see maybe one protest in one city, which is then replicated in other cities, but levels of coordination between these protests, typically focus on a single company, I should say, often are quite sort of informal, although we are seeing some cases of greater formality, but that tends to involve more established unions. So the big issue is, I guess, how these demonstrations of power, associational power, demonstrations of emerging worker voice can start to be embedded in more formal collective frameworks. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think it's very interesting, this contrast between, the pay side on the grassroots and the employment status from the side of the trade unions, established trade unions, which might have, I don't know, that's something we can also pick up later about, this kind of geographical distribution you were also talking about across countries and different groups of workers. But perhaps I would like to give the floor now. I don't know whether Itkar, do you want to, can you wait a little bit, or do you still, how does it work with your situation in where you are?
No, it's fine now.
It's fine now, yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
so we
thank you
can.
so much.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. No, because perhaps I would like to pick up on these aspects of the voice and just go to Denise, wondering about what she can tell us, whether there might be other ways in which workers can build power and negotiation. We have heard from Mark about the protest side, which seems to be very important, but is there also any other form, and what can we learn from your research, Denise?
Thank you very much, Valeria. Thank you, Fiona. I am very glad of being here with you. Very interesting, Mark, your presentation. Well, a little bit of background also about my research. I've conducted research on cooperativism, social economy, and worker-recuperated enterprises in Argentina for a long time. And most recently, I have focused on platform co-ops and how they contribute to the inclusion of workers, and particularly women, during the last year. So I will share some insights that I draw from these various types of studies. It will be like a general introduction on what are cooperatives and what can we learn of cooperatives in this gig economy, in this context. So first of all, something I always feel I have to explain, because I don't know if all of you know, what is a cooperative, what are cooperatives? Cooperatives are organizations that seek to meet common needs based on voluntary and open membership, democratic participation, democratic economic participation too, and concern for community. There are different types of cooperatives depending on the needs they meet. There are public utility cooperatives, worker cooperatives, user cooperatives. There are many types of cooperatives. In general, when we talk about workers, we think about worker cooperatives. But in the gig economy, platform co-ops take different forms. There are also multi-stakeholder cooperatives. I think that one of the main contributions in general of cooperatives is that they provide, in general, decent jobs or work opportunities in more democratic and fair environments than those of the traditional companies. So first, I'd like to share some opportunities I think this model gives workers, and then some of the problems or pitfalls, trying to answer to the question Valeria suggested. The opportunities, I think that we have to look at opportunities in two levels. At the company level, and there is another level that I said, that the movement level, the macro level. I think that it is important to look at both of the levels. At the company level, the micro level, I think that the shared ownership model and the democratic governance that cooperatives foster, that I think these two conditions ensure that cooperatives are driven by the needs of their members. So it is like obvious that they are an effective tool for workers to organize, for social empowerment in general. So at the company level, it is like easy to see the opportunities they give to workers. But I think that if we are really thinking about how to build a collective voice, the mainspring of the change in the distribution of power, it is in another level, at the macro level, the movement level. I think that cooperativism is a global movement, that it is composed of federations, organizations, institutions, and that they have more than 100 years of existence, and they have lots of power. As Mark said, these federations and organizations have institutional power, they have associational power. Even there are many cooperatives with structural power, let's say with economic power. So I think that one of the facts that make platforms nowadays so powerful is their global scale. So in this context, if we want to build a collective voice, I think the cooperative movement, the global cooperative movement, is the critical player, because it has human, economic, institutional, and political resources to build that collective voice. What I want to say is that in order to create a level playing field, it's not enough to build cooperatives, to build isolated cooperatives, to work in cooperatives. I think what is more important is to pay attention to strengthening the cooperative movement. I think that to achieve this, we need like a movement and not isolated co-ops. So it is important to look at both levels. That's one of the insights. And what are the problems or pitfalls of this model if we want to implement it in the gig economy? I think that although the cooperative model enables participation, there are lots of factors and barriers to this effective participation, to this effective voice building. I will mention some of them because of the 5 minutes we have, but then we can talk a bit more. I think there are economic barriers. First of all, because gig workers are, as Uma said, precarized workers, and they don't have time, because time is money. So the first barrier to participate is economic. There are also cultural barriers, because in our societies, in our cultures, participation in our jobs and in our political systems is not fostered. We are not used to participate. So it is a very important barrier to sort out. A third barrier has to do with training, because to carry out co-ops, new capacities and new tasks must be learned. And also on top of this, sometimes institutional and political relations are key to sustain businesses, and these kinds of tasks are often set aside in cooperatives, are not seen as important issues to tackle, to maintain political and institutional relations to ensure sustainability. And I think that a fourth barrier is more subjective, and it has to do with the fact that the gig economy fosters individuality, isolation, flexibility, and it is difficult to build in this context commitment and sense of belonging with a collective enterprise. So we have economic barriers, cultural barriers, subjective barriers, and training barriers. So lots of challenges to solve and to move forward. So that's my main insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. Yeah, this idea of the global idea of the corporativism as a movement and this global dimension is quite important. You also mentioned the importance of the institutions anyhow, aside other source of powers. And here I want to really shift to Itkar from a more labor law, perhaps legal perspective, to dig perhaps a bit more in these institutional resources. And of course, tell us a bit more about what he can tell from his experience about the capacity for, building power and collective voice for gig workers.
Thank you so much, Valeria. Thanks also to the Wage Indicator Foundation for giving me the opportunity. As was informed earlier, I head the labor law team at the Wage Indicator Foundation, and I'm also the founder of Center for Labor Research. We mainly work on the labor rights. We also develop a labor rights index where we compare labor legislation in more than 100 countries. I have a short presentation which I would like to show, and with the promise that it will be done in the time. Okay, one moment. So when you look at the issues related to the platform workers globally, you find these 5 kind of gaps: the wage gap, the rights gaps, the protection gaps, the transparency gap, and the working conditions gaps. And these gaps fundamentally exist because the states have been reluctant or hesitant in regulating this sector. They have adopted the deregulation or this specific way of dealing things where the companies say, okay, if you do this, we will leave your country, or there will be a lot of job losses. So the fundamental responsibility lies on the state, and these gaps all exist because the state has not been taking action. I would like to explain these gaps. While there's no doubt that the platform work offers flexibility, and it does create a lot of employment, especially in developing countries and also in the developed ones. But the issue is that since there is no regulation, or there is a lack of regulation, it creates problems. The first one is the wage gap, and we all know that the platform work is generally low-paid work. But when you look at the research, it is already clear that the platform workers are barely making minimum wages, leave alone the living wage when you take into account the work-related costs. There's also a phenomena of the platform debt, negative incomes, where the cost of working with the platform exceeds the earnings. And we have experienced here in Pakistan and also in the region. Similarly, we also know that the working poverty is higher in the platform workers. Employment misclassification leads to the right gaps, and rights gaps means that the workers don't have access to the employment benefits and the protections in the labor laws, limiting their ability to negotiate the fair terms and conditions. If you ask me, this is actually the bogus self-employment, a way to deprive workers of the protections of the traditional labor rights that have existed for 100 years. Limited social protection, the production gaps. Platform workers often lack access to social protections such as unemployment benefits, worker compensation in the event of an accident, injury, or disease, or the retirement plans. The first reason is that in most of the countries, the platform workers don't have access to the social insurance plans. And even when they do, they are asked to pay double contributions, both for themselves and because they don't have an employer to contribute. And even when they are allowed to contribute, the qualification criteria are set at such a high level that they are actually unable to be part of the social protection systems. Lack of transparency. Platform workers often face challenges due to the opaque rating systems by the platform's arbitrary decision-making algorithms, where they are removed from the platform, and it's not clear how the jobs are being given to them. Similarly, we also see that the working condition gaps do exist, where since the platform workers are considered independent contractors, they don't have access to most of the rights that general workers would have. But I would like to show you something. If a worker is treated as an employee under the labor law, you get access to a whole slew of rights regarding wages, regarding employment conditions, regarding your employment contracts, or the right to unionize or collective bargaining, or right to take the collective action. But if a worker is treated as an independent contractor, you don't have access to most of these rights. This table is only for Pakistan, but we know for sure that there will be a huge gap for each country whenever you want to have a comparative table like this. But this is not only about the workers, it's also about the state, which is losing social contributions thanks to the classification of platform workers as independent contractors. We looked at Pakistan. If we assume that there are 0.7 million workers, platform workers in the country, location-based platform workers in the country, the state is losing 32.25 billion rupees per year, which is equivalent to 109 million euros. This is a lot of amount which the state is losing thanks to only this risk classification. And this amount could be used to give social protection to all of the platform workers. But then there is some party who is taking all the benefit of this thing where the platform workers are being treated as independent contractors. The platforms are getting the benefit because they have 168 days in a year for which they don't have to pay their workers. If you look at annual leaves, sick leaves, the public holidays, the weekly rest days, the gratuity, the contributions, this amounts to 168 days, which is equivalent to 46% of your days in a year, which are unpaid. So the main benefit is being taken by the platform. And I do understand when Uber says that if Europe classifies them as employers, the cost will rise. Obviously, the cost will rise. But then this is the job of the state to ensure that workers are not exploited. And as we see, it's not only the workers, it's also the state which is losing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. And I see also that a lot of questions are coming through the chat. And I see that you also reply to most of those. And you know, I just keep saying to people, just post your questions, and you know, we will try also to keep on track if we can at the very end, or you know, directly during the panel, the different speakers will be able to answer to your questions. Perhaps now the last round of question I want to pose, also related to what you have been telling us in the first part of this panel. Well, and I want to go back to Mark, perhaps pointing more a kind of question related to the policy implications. So what kind of recommendations would you draw by looking at the research that you have been doing in Leeds around this index? I see also there is a question in the chat related to that, and I see that you also replied, in fact, on this. I wanted to point, so I don't say that. But you know, what kind of issue would you point here from your side regarding policy implications? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Valeria. Yeah, I did respond to a question around employment status, and I guess you can look at our research and you can look at wider developments, because what we don't do is we don't look at outcomes from our protests. We just look at the moment, we're just mapping protests. Trying to understand outcomes is something that we need to look at, and you can perhaps deduce from outcomes what you might see as policy agendas. But what we do know more generally is that there's been a lot of movement, and I think Uma touched on this, and there's also research on it, that a lot of governments and regional blocs have started to look at issues around regulation of platforms and the platform economy. A lot of this has focused on the issue of employment status, not solely, but it's been a key area of employment. Sorry, a key area of the debates on regulation. And the important point's been made that employment status is not just around a particular contractual classification. It's also about a whole wide range of other protections that might be included with that employment status, although that will vary significantly by country. So I think that's an important point to make. If we look at our data set on protests around the world, what we find is that protests specifically for employment status are not the dominant rationale and not the dominant motivation for why workers protest. The main reason workers protest, and this is the same across the world, is pay. So the main reason that they're protesting is pay. There's various other issues that might be wrapped up in this, of course, around working conditions, around. Sorry, I've got someone knocking on my door. I can't come down. I'm in a meeting, mate. Sorry, I can't. Sorry, I've actually got a delivery person screaming at me from downstairs. I've got to go and sign something, but I'll ignore him. So the dominant issue is pay. Pay can be linked, of course, to issues around working conditions. It can be related to running costs and things like this. And we find that this is the dominant issue around the world. Employment status is more prevalent in protests in Europe. It's more prevalent in protests in America. We found that protests around health and safety, and I think this is a big issue, is particularly a concern in terms of our patterns globally in South America, Latin America, and also Africa. And this became particularly pronounced during COVID. And I think there were some sort of regulatory responses there. So I think that's a policy agenda as well. So if I think of extracting from this, I could say that a big policy issue relates to pay. It relates to issues around pay transparency, pay consistency, ensuring that workers do get paid, ensuring that there's clarity around what they're getting paid for and what additional costs they might have. There's clearly a policy agenda around health and safety. But a lot of this could actually be wrapped up in employment status in some areas, because if you get employment status, you might also get protections from issues around pay and health and safety. Just to address the question that was put to me around, do workers actually want employee status? So is this actually an agenda that workers themselves want? That's a really good question. And I think what we see that this is a point of debate, I guess. There are clearly cases in some countries where workers have actively been driving legal test cases around employment status. You can see some good examples around Uber, for example. But you can also see cases where states may have started to regulate for employment status, and actually there's quite strong worker mobilizations against it. In other words, workers are actually saying that they prefer self-employment and the flexibility that goes with it. The one country that we've picked up quite a lot in this is the Spanish case. So in Spain, you've got this rider law around employment status and other issues. And there's a number of unions which have been actively campaigning against the rider law. I should note that those unions are front unions supported by the big platform companies themselves. But be that it is as it may, workers are actually taken to the streets to demonstrate against this. So it's quite a sort of complicated issue. Thanks.
Yeah, this is very important, Mark, about the attention on pay and attention also on freedom and autonomy and respect for what should be delivered, and de facto is still not delivered, unfortunately, we see. But yeah, long way to go probably. And then the point is, Denise, this corporativism or a corporative movement could put a solution to these issues. Do you think that is there scope, is there hope? How does it work across countries? Is the only solution?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Valeria. I like your challenging questions. I believe that cooperatives are one possible solution. I'm stressing this word one because it's not like the only one, or it won't work being the only solution. I think that they do build worker power, but I also believe that whether they are a solution or not depends on factors that cooperatives cannot control. Isolated cooperatives cannot control, like repeating what I've said before. I think that cooperatives need changes in legal frameworks. Well, Mark has suggested some avenues, but in legal frameworks, new public policies, and again, a cultural change. So, because laws and public policies are directed to salaried workers, not to worker members and to private companies. So, to be a long-term and viable tool, I think there should be better public policies and laws. So, it is a solution, but especially if they are framed in a set of public initiatives that I stress that social movements can move forward. They have like a key role. And how far the cooperative model can work everywhere? I think that's a very good question. I think that if we think about shared ownership and democratic governance, those are two things that can work everywhere. But what it is crucial is that we have to consider that no model works the same way everywhere. If we are trying to think of a global movement, we have to be aware of this, that no model works the same way everywhere. Perhaps it seems obvious, but sometimes it's not. During the last few years, I studied a platform co-op of sustainable delivery services called Co-opcycle or Copcycle. I guess some of you must know this case. This cooperative was originated in France, and it has been able to function through local co-ops in different countries, including countries in Latin America. I think that one of the main factors that enabled this expansion of Copcycle was that this platform co-op, not without the tensions that this entails, is open to diversity and debate, and understood that what Copcycle understood is that cooperatives and sustainability do not mean the same in all parts of the world. To be more specific, to be able to function in Latin America, Copcycle had to debate if motorbikes could be used instead of bikes. And that was a very sensitive debate in the organization. And they approved motorbikes to be used in certain contexts during a certain period of time. So I think that it was key that the organization could acknowledge different ways of conceiving sustainability and of conceiving cooperatives. I think that this implies being aware that processes do not follow a one-way direction from a center to the rest of the world where copies of the original are produced. I think that when we think about geographic scaling of cooperatives, of this global movement, this should be thought as a process of expansion by territorialization. And with this, I mean that processes have to be addressed like processes of adapting and not replicating. To replicate is a word we hear a lot in the tech field. And I think we should try to think more about adapting processes. And it is very important to think about this in the context of platform co-ops more than, because scale is a debate in the cooperative movement in general. But we have to be especially attentive to this in platform co-ops because the software component makes them appear as easily scalable. It is easy to scale a platform co-op because we have the software. And if it is open source, even better. In the case of Copcycle, it is open source. But the capacity of platforms to scale, it has to do not only with software, but with legal frameworks, public policies, organizational cultures, local identities, and different types of resources that have to be assessed when we think about the feasibility of the platform co-ops. So just to finish, I think that technologies, both digital and social, we don't have to forget that technologies are also social technologies, can operate in a variety of settings, but if we are open to resignification of technologies in different contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Denise. There is a last question for you. Perhaps you might want to reply through the chat about, whether do you think cooperatives can actually deliver on the voice expectation of platform workers, considering also the traditional cooperatives sort of meaning. So that's for you. And I would perhaps now shift to Iftikhar. Perhaps a closure about, what is the position of labor law? What is the position of legislation? We have heard from Mark and also, a bit Denise, talking about this kind of, employment status seems not to alienate with what, although, we know that there is a lot of discussion around that. So what is the position of legal and labor law, particularly as a solution to these kind of problems? If you might want to comment on that. What should be done by labor lawyers or not done or changed?
Iftikhar, you're on mute right now.
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Now, if you ask me, I think it's not about the lawyers, it's about the state. It's to right these wrongs, it is the job of the state to do it. And I like this sentence. It's the time to get indignant. Because the state has been failing its workers just for the mere reason that it allows the big tech firms to exploit these workers, which should not have happened. What is doable is what ILO refers to as the basic labor protections or universal labor guarantees, which should be accessible to, I believe, it should be accessible to everyone, irrespective of their employment or contract status or whatever field they are working in, whether they are domestic workers or platform workers or sanitation workers, or whoever they are. And the legislation should focus that workers should have access to the fundamental workers' rights, the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining, freedom from forced and child labor and discrimination, and access to safe and healthy workplaces. Similarly, they should have the set of basic working conditions in the form of a living wage and limits on the hours of work. We all know the working hours in the platform economy, in the platform sectors, are much more than are generally allowed in the labor legislation elsewhere. Similarly, the workers should have access to the basic social protection in the form of state-administered old age survivors, invalidity, unemployment, and work injury benefits. So this is what we try to work on in Pakistan. But before we go there, while we were developing the legislation in Pakistan, the draft legislation, we also looked at the EU draft platform directive, and we tried to look at the legislative reforms which are happening elsewhere. So we created these employment indicators, and we tried to see whether the platforms in the country, these 6 platforms, whether they meet the employment classification criteria or not. You can see they meet 4 of the 5 criteria. So, and if you want to know more, I mean, we have a full report which is done by my colleagues at the Center for Labor Research together with the Ever Foundation, where we explored this issue of how all these 6 platforms, they meet the employment classification criteria, and by just treating their workers as independent contractors, these workers are not being given their rights. So what we try to do in Pakistan is that we try to draft a legislation which would give these workers rights, the fundamental rights, remaining rights, right to social security, fair wages and wage payments, the working hours and holidays, fair contracts, employment security, and the fair termination. Similarly, we created institutions which would be there to help these workers rather than going to the courts. We created the dispute resolution committees which would be able to resolve the disputes. Similarly, we created a tripartite plus social dialogue mechanism in the form of a platform worker protection council. And similarly, we also added the responsibility of the state to ensure that the workplaces are inspected and workers have access to their workplace rights. So if you look at the legislation that we are trying to do here is that once it is done in the coming months and years, hopefully in the months, not years, although it is a reality that development of legislation sometimes takes much more time than we think. The workers would have access to minimum wage, working hour restrictions, premium wage payments for work on weekly rest days or public holidays during night hours. And similarly, they would have access to health and safety protection, including heat action plans. We added these terms and conditions because workers, especially the delivery workers, had to work in severe heat. So we have also added these kind of terms in the draft legislation that we have in the country. Similarly, the workers would have access to various kinds of leave, but not limited to annual sick leave and maternity leave, as well as the access to social protection. We added the terms on fair contracts, right, to accessible, comprehensible contracts, not 25, 30 pages contracts where a person can't understand what is happening, and to ensure that the platforms have to follow the local labor legislation rather than the big giant tech firms, as they call themselves, referring to some other location where a worker would never be able to access their rights. No exclusion of platform liability, information of dynamic pricing, how it is happening, and the worker should have access to it. And similarly, workers should know if there are any changing in the existing frameworks, rather than they knowing on the same day. As in the terms of the fair management systems, we've also included that the workers should be protected from different kinds of discrimination and harassment. In terms of fair representation, we have included clear provisions on the right to unionize and collective bargaining, as well as the workers having the right to collective action. What I'm trying to say is that similar kind of exercises are happening in so many places. But what can be done is that if it is difficult for the states to give a whole slew of rights to the platform workers, it can be done in a phased manner. And one way would be to at least ensure that the workers should have access to the universal labor guarantees, as the ILO calls it, or the basic labor protections, which should be available to everyone without any regard to your contract status. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Itkar. I like these ending notes on the role of the state and the responsibilities of the state also in all these. I would like to thank very much these three excellent speakers we had today, Mark, Denise, and Itkar. Thank you very much for being with us. And I pass over to Fiona.
Thanks a lot, Valeria, Mark, Iftika, and Denise for your time. Also, I also know that we're all very, very busy, so I'm happy to have you reflect on these important points. And as you can see in the chat, many people would want to know more, so that's great. Thank you.